The evening at Mar-a-Lago was draped in an air of quiet anticipation, the grand estate standing as an emblem of power and influence, its halls filled with whispers of past negotiations and future ambitions. Outside, the waves crashed methodically against the shore, the golden glow of the setting sun casting elongated shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns. Inside, beneath the towering chandeliers that bathed the room in warm, golden light, three figures sat at a polished mahogany table, a setting as intimate as it was significant. Elon Musk, the billionaire innovator and mastermind behind Tesla and SpaceX, leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable, eyes sharp with the intensity of a man who had spent a lifetime solving impossible problems. Across from him, Donald Trump exuded his signature presence. Dominant, charismatic, and unreadable in a way only a seasoned dealmaker could be. The two men, both known for their unpredictability and their outsized impact on the world stage, sat face to face in what was supposed to be a private discussion, a strategic meeting away from the public eye, away from the endless speculation of the media. But tonight's meeting was different, not just because of who was present, but because of who had been unexpectedly brought along. Between them, swinging his feet slightly under the table, sat Musk's young son, X, a boy whose piercing blue eyes mirrored his father's brilliance, his quiet intensity hinting at a mind that never stopped processing, never stopped thinking. He wasn't originally meant to be there, but in a decision characteristic of Musk's unpredictable nature, he had brought him along anyway. He wanted to come, Musk had shrugged when Trump's assistant raised an eyebrow. Figured it'd be interesting for him. Trump, never one to turn down an audience, had chuckled, brushing it off with a casual remark about how the kid already had better taste than most politicians. And so there they sat. 3 generations, 3 legacies, 3 perspectives on the future. The conversation began as expected. A convergence of 2 of the world's most influential minds, each with their own vision of the future. Politics naturally took center stage, with Trump steering the discussion toward the next election, the economy, and the shifting dynamics of power. Musk, however, was more concerned with the long game, his thoughts revolving around AI, automation, and the looming precipice upon which civilization now stood. The problem, Musk mused, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of his glass, isn't whether we advance AI, it's whether we control it before it controls us. Trump, ever the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. So, what's the move? You going to run for something or just keep pulling the strings from the sideline? Musk smirked, the corner of his lips barely twitching. You know, I prefer to build things. Trump gestured vaguely, his tone laced with amusement. That's what they said about me before 2016. A chuckle, a sip of whiskey, a pause filled with the weight of unspoken calculations. Despite their differences, there was an understanding between them. An unspoken recognition of what it meant to shape the world in ways few could comprehend. But beneath the surface of this discussion, beneath the exchanges of power and strategy, there was something else simmering in the air, something that neither Musk nor Trump had foreseen. Because sitting between them, listening intently, absorbing every word, was X, and what he was about to say would change the course of the conversation entirely. The conversation had been flowing naturally, a measured exchange between 2 of the world's most influential men, each accustomed to shaping the future in their own way. Musk, ever the visionary, spoke of artificial intelligence and automation, the looming revolution that could either propel civilization forward or send it spiraling into an abyss of uncontrollable consequences. Trump, always the strategist, leaned into the discussion with a mixture of intrigue and skepticism, weighing Musk's words against his own instincts, his mind never straying too far from the next election, the next deal, the next move. The air in the private lounge was thick with the energy of 2 minds that thrived on disruption, both seeking to bend the arc of history in their favor. And then the shift happened. It wasn't a bold declaration from Musk or a sharp retort from Trump. It wasn't a heated debate over policy or power. It was a single question, spoken in a voice far softer than theirs, but carrying an impact neither of them expected. X, who had been sitting quietly between them, his sharp blue eyes absorbing every word, tilted his head slightly and spoke with the clarity of someone who had been turning the thought over in his mind for some time. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice calm and unshaken. "Are you afraid of being forgotten?" The room went still. Musk, caught mid-sip of his drink, paused, his gaze flicking toward his son with sudden interest. Trump's expression froze. Just for a fraction of a second, a moment so brief that most wouldn't have noticed. But Musk did. It was the kind of pause that came not from anger or frustration, but from something deeper, something more human. Then, just as quickly, Trump recovered. He let out a laugh, that signature Trump laugh, part amusement, part performance, part deflection. "Forgotten?" he echoed, shaking his head, leaning back slightly. "Kid, I've got my name on buildings from here to Scotland. They'll be talking about me long after we're all gone." The answer was classic Trump, bold, confident, designed to dismiss the question before it could take root. A few chuckles rippled from the far end of the room, where staff members lingered, their presence discreet but ever watchful. But X didn't blink. He didn't laugh. He simply watched, waiting, as if he had already anticipated that answer. And then, with the same measured tone, he clarified, "That's not what I mean." Trump's smirk faltered just slightly. He studied the boy for a moment before leaning in, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "Oh yeah?" he said, his voice edged with curiosity. "Then what do you mean?" The boy sat up a little straighter, unbothered by the weight of Trump's scrutiny. "I mean, when people talk about you 100 years from now, what will they actually say? Will they just remember your name, or will they remember who you really were?" The atmosphere in the room shifted again, this time more noticeably. The murmurs in the background faded. The clinking of glasses and the occasional rustling of papers ceased. Even Musk, who had spent years watching some of the world's greatest minds challenge each other in conversation, found himself caught in the moment, intrigued not just by the question, but by how Trump would answer. And for the first time in the entire discussion, Trump didn't have an immediate response. It wasn't hesitation born out of uncertainty. Trump had faced harder questions, tougher opponents, more brutal debates. No, this was something else, something Musk recognized immediately. Reflection. A flicker of thought crossed Trump's face, a rare and fleeting vulnerability buried beneath years of cultivated confidence. Because the boy's question wasn't about power or wealth. It wasn't about deals or elections. It was about something far more profound. Legacy. Would history remember the victories or the controversies? Would they remember him as a leader, a fighter, or simply as a name in the history books, surrounded by noise and debate? Trump exhaled, tapping his fingers against the table, his mind clearly working through the weight of the question. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice measured in a way that was different from before. "The trick," he said slowly, "isn't making people remember your name. It's making them remember why you mattered." X tilted his head slightly, considering the response. "And why do you think you matter?" Another pause. Musk leaned forward slightly now, watching, waiting, as the conversation took a turn no one in the room had expected. For the first time, Trump wasn't performing, he wasn't defending, he was thinking. And that was when Musk realized this conversation wasn't over, it was just beginning. Trump sat back slightly, his fingers still tapping rhythmically against the polished table, his mind visibly processing X's question in a way Musk had rarely seen before. This wasn't the usual exchange of power, of calculated statements meant to control a narrative or shift public perception. It wasn't about politics or business deals or legacy in the way most people defined it. It was something more personal, something deeper. Something that, for once, Trump didn't have a rehearsed answer for. Musk observed closely, fascinated by the shift in energy. He had seen Trump maneuver through impossible conversations, had watched him dismantle opponents in debates, had witnessed his ability to turn any question into a strategic advantage. But now, sitting across from a boy who had nothing to gain and no agenda to push, he was seeing something different. There was no audience here to impress, no reporters to spin a headline, no voters to win over. It was just a child, asking a question that struck at something fundamental, something that power and wealth couldn't shield against. X, still composed, still unshaken by the weight of the moment, didn't look away. He simply waited, his small hands folded neatly in front of him, as if he understood that silence had a power of its own. Trump finally exhaled, shifting his gaze from the boy to Musk, as if searching for an ally, for some sign that this was a setup, that there was a larger game being played. But Musk didn't intervene. He merely shrugged, the faintest hint of amusement flickering across his face. He wanted to see where this would go. "You ask a lot of questions, kid," Trump said finally, his voice measured, his usual bravado slightly tempered. "That's good. Most people don't ask the right ones." X nodded slightly, accepting the statement as a compliment but not letting it deter him from his original point. "So," he pressed, "why do you think you mattered?" Trump's fingers stopped tapping. He inhaled slowly through his nose, his expression shifting, something unreadable flashing across his face. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, "Because I woke people up." X didn't blink. Woke them up to what? Trump's eyes narrowed slightly, not in frustration but in thought. "To the fact that power isn't just for the elite," he said. "That they don't have to listen to what some journalist or some politician tells them. That they can fight." There it was, that defiance, that belief in his own impact. But X was unfazed. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "And do you think they'll remember why you fought?" A long pause. Musk watched as Trump's jaw clenched just slightly, the flicker of hesitation in his expression revealing more than words ever could. It was a question he had never been asked so directly. It was one thing to believe you had changed the world. It was another to control how history remembered that change. "You think I failed?" Trump finally asked, his voice quieter now, more introspective than Musk had ever heard before. X shook his head. "I think you changed the world. A beat. But I don't think you get to choose how history writes you." Musk almost smirked, but he held it back, watching the way Trump absorbed the words. This was a rare moment, one that couldn't be manufactured or planned. Trump wasn't just answering a question anymore. He was confronting something he had likely never allowed himself to think about, because no matter how powerful a person was, no matter how many battles they had won, no one could dictate how the future would remember them. History had a way of simplifying things, of stripping away justifications and context until all that was left was an echo of who someone once was. Trump exhaled, rubbing his fingers together as he stared at the table for a moment. When he finally looked back up, his expression was unreadable. "You're raising a thinker," he muttered toward Musk. Musk chuckled softly. "He gets it from himself." Trump smirked slightly, shaking his head, then turned his gaze back to X. "All right, kid," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual confidence. "Since you're so full of questions, let me ask you one." X blinked but nodded. Trump steepled his fingers. "What do you think matters most? What makes a man truly remembered?" X considered it for a long moment. Then, with the same quiet certainty that had guided the entire conversation, he answered. And what he said left both men in silence. Trump sat back in his chair, the usual bravado that accompanied his words momentarily dimmed, replaced by something more introspective, more uncertain. He had always been a man of action, of spectacle, of dominance in any room he entered. He had spent decades building an empire, branding his name into skylines, headlines, and history itself. He had stood at the pinnacle of power, had commanded stages, had been both revered and reviled, but never ignored. Yet, here he was, facing a question from a boy barely old enough to understand the weight of legacy, and for the first time in a long time, Trump was forced to pause. X's question still lingered in the air, unshaken by the silence that followed. What makes a man truly remembered? It wasn't about wealth or status or even victory. It was deeper than that. Something beyond Trump's usual rhetoric, something that peeled away the layers of power and left only the raw truth beneath. Trump tapped his fingers lightly against the table, a steady rhythm that betrayed the wheels turning in his mind. "People remember strength," he said finally, his voice measured, deliberate. "They remember fighters. They remember the ones who never back down." X nodded slightly, absorbing the answer, but not yet satisfied. "But do they remember why they fought?" Trump narrowed his eyes just a fraction, studying the boy as if trying to decipher whether this was simple curiosity or something more calculated.
Musk remained quiet, watching with an amused but intrigued expression, letting his son navigate the conversation without interference. "They remember what I stood for," Trump continued, leaning forward slightly. "They remember that I told them they didn't have to be pushed around, that they could take control of their lives. That's what real influence is." X tilted his head slightly, unfazed. "But what if they only remember the fight, not the reason behind it? What if history remembers the noise, but not the message?" Trump stilled for just a moment. Musk saw it. Saw the way the words landed. Saw the way they chipped away at the armor of certainty Trump had always worn. Because that was the question, wasn't it? He had fought, that much was undeniable. He had shaken the foundations of politics, had forced the world to listen, had built an empire with nothing but his own will and determination. But history had a way of distilling legacies into something simpler, something cleaner. And that wasn't always within one's control. "You think history will twist things?" Trump asked, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. X didn't blink. "I think history remembers what it wants to, and sometimes it remembers the wrong things." Trump exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "That's politics, kid. People will twist anything if it serves them." X considered that for a moment, then asked, "And does that scare you?" The room went still again. Musk, who had spent years debating some of the greatest minds of his generation, who had spent a lifetime pushing the boundaries of what was possible, realized that this wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was something rare, something real. This wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about something far more personal. Trump rubbed his fingers together, staring at the table for a beat longer than necessary. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't like losing." A pause. "And I don't like being forgotten." X studied him, his young mind processing the weight of that admission. "Then maybe the real question isn't whether people remember you," he said softly. "It's whether they'll remember you the way you want them to." Another beat of silence. Musk watched, his gaze flickering between his son and Trump, fascinated by the exchange. Trump had spent his life controlling narratives, defining his own legacy, ensuring that his name would be etched into history. But for the first time, he was being confronted with the one thing he couldn't control: how history would choose to tell his story. "You're raising a dangerous thinker," Trump muttered toward Musk, though there was no irritation in his tone, only something that almost resembled respect. Musk chuckled, shaking his head. "He's his own thinker." Trump smirked slightly, glancing back at X. "And what about you, kid?" he asked, the usual sharpness returning to his voice. "You ask all these questions about legacy? Do you think you'll be remembered?" X didn't hesitate. "I don't care if I am." Trump raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Why?" X's answer came without a second thought. "Because the people I love will remember me, and that's enough." Trump stilled again, the words settling into the space between them. Musk exhaled softly, shaking his head with something between admiration and amusement. "That," he said, "is an answer." And for the first time that evening, Trump had nothing to say.
The weight of X's words still lingered in the air, the conversation having shifted from power and legacy to something far more personal, something that neither Trump nor Musk had anticipated. Trump, uncharacteristically quiet, was still processing what had just been said when X, with the same steady and unshaken tone, turned his gaze toward his father. Musk had spent much of the conversation observing, intrigued by the dynamic unfolding between his son and Trump, but now he was no longer just a spectator. X's next question was directed at him, and unlike the philosophical debate about history and memory, this one struck far closer to home. "Dad," X said simply, his voice calm but pointed, "do you ever wonder how you've changed me?" Musk, who had spent his life answering impossible questions about the future of energy,
The colonization of Mars, the risks of artificial intelligence, found himself hesitating for the first time. He blinked, adjusting slightly in his seat, not out of discomfort, but because, for once, he didn't have an immediate answer. He could talk endlessly about his vision for humanity, about the technological revolutions he had helped create. But this was different. This wasn't about theories or innovation. It was about him, about the choices he had made, about the life he had built, not just for the world, but for his own son. Trump, sensing the shift, leaned back slightly, watching with curiosity, perhaps relieved that, for once, the hard questions weren't directed at him. Musk exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his mind sorting through the reality of what X had just asked. He had always believed in progress, in pushing the boundaries of what was possible, in dedicating every ounce of himself to work that would outlive him. He had built Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and so much more, each venture consuming him in a way that left little room for anything else. He had convinced himself it was worth it, that history would judge his sacrifices kindly, that the future he was building was justification enough for the moments he had missed. But looking at X now, he knew the answer wasn't that simple. "I think about it a lot," Musk admitted, his voice quieter than before, more introspective. "Probably more than you know." X studied him, waiting, giving him space to continue. Musk sighed, glancing toward the table, his fingers tracing the condensation on his glass. "I've missed things," he admitted, and the words felt heavier than he expected. Birthdays, first steps, conversations I should have had. I told myself it was necessary, that I was doing something bigger than myself, something that would make you proud one day. He looked up, meeting X's gaze. "But sometimes, I wonder if I was wrong." The room was silent. Even Trump, usually quick with a remark or a joke, said nothing. X's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that Musk had seen reflect his own intensity, softened just slightly. "Would you do it differently?" X asked, his voice free of accusation, free of judgment. Just curiosity, just understanding. Musk hesitated because that was the question, wasn't it? Would he trade Mars for memories? Would he trade Tesla for time? Would he undo years of sleepless nights, of pushing the limits of possibility, just to be there for things that couldn't be replicated? "I don't know," he said finally, and the honesty in his voice was undeniable. "I don't know if I could have built everything I did without sacrificing something." X nodded as if he already knew that was the answer. "But I do know," Musk continued, his voice firmer now, "that I don't want to miss anything else." X raised an eyebrow slightly. "For real?" Musk nodded. "For real." X, ever perceptive, smirked slightly. "Then you might have to delete some emails," Musk groaned, shaking his head while Trump let out a laugh, breaking the heaviness of the moment. "Kids got you," Trump muttered, amused. Musk exhaled, shaking his head, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind. Because for all the futures he had built, for all the worlds he had dreamed of, he knew this, right here, was the one that mattered most.
The weight of the conversation lingered between them, the unspoken truths hanging in the air like a thick mist that neither man could brush away. For all the power they had wielded, for all the influence they had commanded, they were now sitting at a table, confronted not by opponents or rivals, but by the undeniable truth that no amount of wealth, no number of achievements, no grand titles could rewrite time. Trump, a man who had spent his life moving forward, refusing to look back, now found himself staring directly at something he had long avoided: regret.
He tapped his fingers against the table, his gaze distant, his mind clearly running through years of decisions, victories, and battles that had defined him. He had won more fights than most men could dream of, but now, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he had won the ones that truly mattered. "Regrets are useless," he muttered after a long pause, as if trying to convince himself. "You can't change them, you just have to keep moving." Musk, who had been watching him carefully, exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but you can change what comes next." Trump's fingers stopped tapping. He looked up, his sharp, calculating eyes locking onto Musk's. It was a simple statement, but one that carried the weight of a realization Trump hadn't yet allowed himself to process. The past was written, yes, but the future, it was still his to shape. "And what comes next for you?" Trump asked, tilting his head slightly. Musk smirked faintly, but there was no arrogance in it, only reflection. "More time," he said simply. "Less missed moments?" Trump arched a brow. "That easy, huh?" "No, but necessary." X, who had remained quiet for a moment, watching the exchange unfold, finally leaned forward, his small hands resting against the edge of the table. "That's the only part of a legacy you can control," he said, his voice steady, filled with the clarity of someone who saw the world in a way that few others did. "Not how people remember you, just how you choose to be with them while you're here." The simplicity of it cut through everything. Trump exhaled, rubbing his jaw, and for the first time, he didn't try to argue, didn't try to spin it, didn't try to turn the conversation back to control or dominance or power, because deep down, he knew the kid was right. He had spent his life making people remember his name, ensuring that history wouldn't forget him, but had he done enough to make sure the people closest to him, the ones who truly mattered, remembered him the way he wanted them to? Musk, too, let the words settle. He had always lived in the future, always looking to the next project, the next frontier, the next impossible challenge. But what X had said struck something deeper than logic or ambition. For all the worlds he had dreamed of, for all the civilizations he wanted to build beyond Earth, he had spent so much time running toward the unknown that he had forgotten to stop and appreciate what he already had. Trant leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression still unreadable, but his mind clearly working through something that wasn't entirely comfortable. "So, let me get this straight," he said after a moment, a wry smirk forming at the corner of his lips. "You're telling me that the secret to a legacy isn't how big you make it, but how close." X nodded without hesitation. "History remembers what it wants, but the people who love you, they remember who you really were." The words were final, unquestionable, and they left both men in silence, not because they disagreed, but because, for the first time, they understood.
The conversation had started as something else entirely. Two of the most powerful men in the world sitting across from each other, discussing politics, technology, and the future. It was supposed to be about strategy, about influence, about how to shape the world in their own ways. But now, as the night stretched on and the weight of their words settled, it had become something neither of them had expected. This wasn't about winning an election or building a company that would last for centuries. It wasn't about who had the most power, the most wealth, or the biggest impact on history. It was about something much simpler and far more difficult to grasp. The idea that, in the end, none of those things mattered as much as the people whose lives you touched.
Trump, always the deal maker, the fighter, the man who had built an empire with his name stamped onto everything he touched, had spent his life ensuring that the world would remember him. But for the first time, he was confronted with a question he had never fully considered. Would they remember him for the reasons he wanted them to? Musk, the visionary, the man who looked beyond Earth itself, had spent his life chasing the future, pushing humanity toward new frontiers, always moving, always building. But tonight, he was reminded that the future wasn't just Mars or AI or the next big innovation. It was also the time he had with the people he cared about now, the moments he had missed, and the ones he still had a chance to reclaim. And at the center of it all was X, a child who had asked the simplest and most profound question of all. Not about power, not about history, but about memory. Not the kind of memory that gets written into textbooks or plastered across buildings, but the kind that lingers in the hearts of those who truly knew you. He had stripped away the layers of ambition, of competition, of the need to be the biggest, the loudest, the most remembered, and had laid bare the truth that even the most powerful men struggled with. At the end of it all, what truly mattered was not how many people knew your name, but how deeply you had changed the lives of those closest to you. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't the pause of men searching for a way to regain control of a conversation that had slipped into unexpected territory. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with reflection, with the realization that some questions didn't have simple answers. Trump finally exhaled, shaking his head with a quiet chuckle, but there was no dismissal in it, no deflection. "You're raising a thinker," he muttered toward Musk. Musk smirked, shaking his head. "He raises himself." Trump turned back to X, studying him for a long moment before nodding. "You're right, kid," he admitted. "History remembers what it wants, but the people who love you, they remember who you really were." X nodded, satisfied with the answer. Musk sat back, exhaling, as if something unspoken had settled within him as well. For all the battles fought, for all the legacies built, for all the things that seemed so monumental in the grand scheme of the world, this, right here, was the truth that mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, none of them felt the need to say anything more, because for once the answer had already been found.
As we journey through life, accumulating experiences, achievements, and challenges, we often measure our worth by the impact we leave behind. Many spend decades building businesses, establishing careers, and seeking recognition, believing that their legacy is defined by how widely their name is known or how many accomplishments they can list. But as the conversation between Trump, Musk, and X revealed, true legacy is not found in wealth, power, or influence. It is in the lives we touch, in the relationships we nurture, and in the love we leave behind. For older generations who have witnessed the passing of time, this lesson holds even greater significance.
We come to understand that while success and ambition may have driven us in our younger years, the memories that truly matter are not those of boardrooms or victories, but of the moments spent with family, the wisdom shared with younger generations, and the kindness extended to others. History may remember names, but it often distorts intentions, reducing complex lives into simple narratives. However, those closest to us, our children, our friends, our loved ones, remember us for who we truly were, for the way we made them feel, for the lessons we imparted not through words, but through actions. This is a powerful reminder that it is never too late to focus on what truly matters. Time is fleeting, but we still have the power to shape the way we are remembered, not through grand gestures, but through the simple acts of presence, kindness, and understanding. Whether it is making an effort to reconnect with loved ones, passing down knowledge to younger generations, or simply choosing to be more present in the lives of those we care about, the greatest legacy we can leave is one of love and impact. In the end, the world may forget our names, but the people whose lives we've touched will always carry a piece of us with them. And that is the kind of legacy that truly lasts.